Leia Organa made another half-hearted try at adjusting her rain-slicked hair, then gave up in disgust and peered out at the lush growth surrounding her. After losing all contact with Luke, she'd managed to land hard in this wet hell. She took some measure of comfort in knowing that if Luke had also survived sat down, he'd try to reach her. After all, his job was to see that she arrived safely at Sakapis 4. Angrily she mused that now she was going to be rather more than slightly late for the conference. A quick examination had indicated that she would no longer have to worry about the malfunctioning port engine, which was now a crumpled oblong metal shape, incapable of propelling itself or anything else across so much as a light second. The rest of the Y-wing was in little better shape. She considered looking for Luke. But it made more sense for one of them to wait for the arrival of the other, and she knew Luke would come for her as soon as he was ready. "Pardon me, Princess," said the metal form behind her, "but do you think R2 and Master Luke set down safely in this awful place?" "Of course they did. Luke's the best pilot we've got. If I made it down, I'm certain he had no trouble." That was a slight lie. What if Luke was lying injured somewhere, unable to move, and she simply sat here awaiting him? Better not to think about that. The vision of a twisted, broken Luke, bleeding to death in the cockpit of his X-wing, made her insides spin tightly. She slid back the roof of the cockpit once again, her nose wrinkling at the rankness of the dripping morass encircling them. Plenty of noise assailed her from hidden things moving stealthily through the undergrowth. Nothing larger than a couple of brightly hued quasi-insects had shown themselves thus far, however. Her pistol rested comfortably on her lap. Not that she'd need it, secure as she was in the cockpit whose sliding roof panel she could throw back in place and lock in seconds. She was perfectly safe. 3PO felt otherwise. "I don't like this place, Princess. I don't like it at all." "Relax. There can't be anything out there," she nodded toward the densest growth, "that would find you digestible." A shrill, hooting cry sounded like a sick trumpet close on her left. She jerked around sharply, sucking in a startled breath. But there was nothing there. Her face pressed close by the open port as she strove to penetrate the green-brown wall of vegetation with anxious eyes. When the noise did not recur, she forced herself to relax. "Do you see anything, 3PO?" "No, Princess. Nothing larger than a few small arthropods, and I'm scanning with infrared also." "That doesn't mean something large and inimical couldn't be out there." "But you don't see anything?" "No." She was furious at herself. A simple noise had panicked her. Probably only the forlorn cry of some harmless herbivore, and she'd panicked like an infant. It would not happen again. She was angry because whatever had caused them to crash would certainly cause her to miss her scheduled arrival demonstration on Sakapis, possibly aggravating the government officials assigned to greet her. She was twice over angry at Luke. Angry for not performing a navigational miracle and following her safely down without instruments or control, and angry most of all because he'd been right in insisting they ought not land here. So she sat and fumed silently to herself, alternately conjuring up the curses she'd employ when he finally did arrive and worrying about what she'd do if he didn't. Oh whoop. Again the trumpeting sound. Whatever had produced it had not left after all. If anything, the sharp hooting sounded closer. This time her hand tightened around the pistol. Once more she examined the surrounding jungle, saw nothing. As she stared she theorized. Suppose she had misinterpreted that landing beacon somehow. Suppose it was only the barest of automatic installations and this world was devoid not only of mechanics but of facilities for organic travelers as well. If Luke was dead she'd be marooned here alone, without any idea of. There was a loud crashing, off to her right this time. Swinging around in the seat she instinctively fired off a burst through the cracked port and was rewarded with the odor of burnt, wet vegetable matter. The muzzle of the pistol remained focused on the carbonized spot. Hopefully, she'd hit the thing. Fortunately, she hadn't. "It's me," a voice shouted, sounding more than a little shaky. She'd barely missed him. "It's me and R2. R2-D2. 3PO clambered out of the cockpit, moved to greet his squat counterpart. "R2, it's good to." 3PO paused, then continued in a different tone. "What do you think you're doing, making me wait like this? When I think of the anguish you've caused me." "Luke, are you all right?" He began climbing up the damaged side of the fighter, sat down next to the open cockpit. "Yes. I touched down behind you. I was afraid, R2, and I might miss you. I was afraid you." She stopped, looked down, unable to meet his gaze. "I apologize, Luke. I made a mistake in trying to land here." Luke also looked away, embarrassed. Nobody could have foreseen the atmospheric disturbance that forced us down Leia. She looked into the jungle. "I managed to plot the location of that homing beacon before my instruments went out completely." She pointed slightly behind them and to her left. "It's back that way. Once we reach the station we can locate whoever's in charge and arrange for passage off this world." "If there's a station," Luke pointed out mildly, "or anyone in charge of it." "It occurred to me that it might be a fully automated station," she confessed, "but I don't know what else we can do." "Agreed," said Luke with a slow sigh. "We've got nothing to gain by sitting here. I used to believe in miracles. I don't anymore. We can get eaten just as quickly here as we can on the trail." The princess looked downcast. "You've encountered carnivorous life, then?" "No, hardly any life at all, actually. The only animal of any size I confronted," he went on with a slight grin, "took one look at me and ran off like a spooked panther." He turned, moved to enter the cockpit. "Let's get started while it's still light. I'll give you a hand making up a pack." Carefully he lowered himself in next to her. As he unlatched her seat he became conscious of the confined space they were working in. Awkwardly pressed up against him, the princess seemed to take no notice of their proximity. In the dampness, though, her body heat was near palpable to Luke and he had to force himself to keep his attention on what he was doing. Raising herself from the cockpit, the princess stood on the nose of the fighter and reached down to him. "Hand it up, Luke." He lifted the burgeoning pack. "Too heavy?" he asked as he handed it to her. She slid it onto her back, slipped both arms through the straps and adjusted the weight before tightening them. The burden of public office was a lot heavier, she shot back. "Let's get moving." Briskly scrambling over the side, she let herself drop to the ground, planted her feet, took 2 steps in the direction of the distant beacon, and began to sink. "Luke." 3PO. "Take it easy, princess." Edging carefully over the same side, he walked out on the intact wing facing her. "Luke." Already she was up to her knees in grey muck. If anything, she was beginning to sink faster. Trying to anchor himself with his left hand, Luke reached out with his right from the wing edge. "Lean toward me. R2, you lock onto the ship. 3PO, give me your hand." She did as she was told, the motion generating squelching sounds from the bog. Her hand flailed for him, smacking the soft ground many centimeters from his. Rising, he scrambled back to the cockpit and retrieved his walking stick, then returned hurriedly to his prone position on the wing and extended it. "Lean toward me," he urged her again. 3PO, you and R2 hold tight or I'll go in with her. "Don't worry, sir," 3PO assured him. R2 added a whistle. She was up to her waist now. On the first try she missed the pole. The second time her fingers locked around it, were joined by her other hand. Luke wrapped both hands around his end of the stick and sat up on the wing, leaning back. His feet slid and scraped on the smooth metal. "R2, 3PO, pull." Having secured a firm grip on her, the Earth was reluctant to yield its prize. Every muscle in his body taut, Luke struggled to heave and to conjure the force simultaneously. He tried to put all of his weight behind his arms, behind his desperate pull. A tired sucking noise sounded, and the princess lurched forward. Luke allowed his exhausted arms a brief respite and hyperventilated while he had the chance. "You can play toy engine later," the princess admonished him. "Pull now." Momentary anger gave him enough energy to pull her the rest of the way clear. Reaching down, he gave her a hand up and then they were both sitting on the edge of the wing. Covered from the ribs down in a packing of green-grey mud and pieces of what looked like dried straw, the princess appeared decidedly unregal. She pushed futilely at the mud, which was drying rapidly to the consistency of thin concrete. She said nothing, and Luke knew anything he might venture would not be terribly well received. "Come on," he suggested simply. Taking up his walking stick, he moved to the back side of the wing. Leaning over, he probed at the ground, which displayed no inclination to eat his stick. But still he kept one hand on the wing edge when he stepped off. His feet sank, but only half a centimeter into the spongy loam. Yet the earth here looked no different from the quick clay that had almost taken the princess. She dropped down easily beside him and soon they were traveling through intermittent patches of half-familiar vegetation. Branches and bushes blocked tired legs and occasional thorns tore hopefully at them, but Luke's assumption that the ground beneath the taller growths was the firmest held true with gratifying consistency. Even the weighty droids didn't sink into the muck. From time to time as they hiked along, the princess would dab or push disgustedly at her lower body, which was now solidly caked with the gook she'd slid into. She remained unusually quiet. Luke couldn't tell whether her silence was due to a desire to conserve her strength or embarrassment at her present situation. He tended to think the former. To his knowledge, being embarrassed was not something she was subject to. Frequently they would pause, turn circles, and then match up pointer alignment on their tracams to ensure they were still marching toward the beacon site. "Even if it is an automatic station," he remarked several days later, in an effort to cheer her, "somebody put it down here and so they have to maintain it. However infrequently. I saw some pretty big ruins near the place we sat down. Perhaps natives are still living in them or they might be empty, but the beacon could be for the use of a xenoarchaeological research post." "That's possible," she admitted brightly. "Yes, that would also explain why the beacon's not listed. A small scientific outpost could be temporary. And recent," Luke added, excited by the plausibility of his own supposition. Just talking about such a possibility made them both feel better. If that's the case, then even an automated station that's only used on occasion ought to contain an emergency shelter and survival provisions. Heck, there might even be a subspace planetary relay for contacting Sakapas for when the scientific team is operating here. "A cry for help would be a poor way for me to announce my presence," the princess observed, brushing at her dark hair. "Not," she added quickly, "that I'm going to be particular. I'll settle for arriving in a medical cocoon." They walked on in silence for a while before another question entered Luke's mind. "I still wonder, Princess, what caused our instruments to go crazy? That enormous volume of rising free energy we passed through, bolts jumping from sky to ship and ship back to sky again. I've never seen anything like that before." "Nor have I, sir," commented 3PO. "I thought I might go mad." "Neither have I," admitted the princess thoughtfully. "And I've never read of a natural phenomenon like it. Several colonized gas giants have bigger storms, but never with so much color. And big thunderheads are always involved. We were above the thick cloud layer when it happened." Still, she hesitated, the whole thing seemed almost familiar, somehow. R2 beeped his agreement. "You'd think whoever established that homing beacon in this area would also have put a message in the transmission warning ships away from the danger." "Yes," the princess agreed. "Hard to imagine a scientific expedition, or any other kind, being that negligent. The omission, it's almost criminal." She shook her head slowly. "That effect. I can almost remember something like it." A diffident smile, then, "My head's still full of the conference. It should be, Luke thought, full of one thing only, making it to that homing beacon and hoping there was more there than just a pile of machinery. What he said was, "I understand, Princess." Not the Force, but a more ancient, more highly developed sense in man half convinced him they were being watched. He found himself turning rapidly to scan the trees and mist behind them and at each side. Nothing looked back at him, but the feeling refused to go away. Once she spotted him peering hard at a dank copse. Nervous? It was part question, part challenge. "You bet I'm nervous," he shot back. "I'm nervous and frightened, and I wish to hell we were on Secapus right now. Anywhere on Secapus, instead of trudging through this swamp on foot." Turning serious, the princess told him, "One learns to accept whatever events life has in store with the best possible spirits." She stared straight ahead. "That's just what I'm doing," Luke confessed, accepting them in the best possible spirits, nervousness and fear. "Well, you needn't look at me as if this is all my fault." "Did I imply that? Did I say that?" Luke countered, a touch more tightly than he intended. She glanced sharply at him and he cursed his inability to conceal his feelings. He would have been, he decided, a rotten card player. Or politician. "No, but you as much as..." She began hotly. "Princess," he interrupted softly, "we still have a long way to go, according to your plotted location. Just because something full of teeth and claws hasn't pounced on us from every tree doesn't mean such creatures don't thrive here. One thing we haven't got is time to fight between ourselves. Besides, responsibility is a dead issue now. It's been superseded by survival. Survive we will, if the Force is with us." There was no reply. That in itself was encouraging. They trudged on, Luke stealing admiring glances at her when she wasn't looking. Disheveled and caked with mud from the waist down, she was still beautiful. He knew she was upset, not at him, but at the possibility they might miss the scheduled conference with the Circapusian underground. There's no night so dark as a night filled with fog, and every night on Mimban was like that. They made a bed for themselves between the parted roots of a great tree. While the princess started a fire, Luke and the droids constructed a rain shelter by stretching the two survival capes between both massive roots. They huddled together for warmth and watched the night try to slip around the edges of the fire. It crackled reassuringly despite the mist as the night sounds chorused around them. They were no different from day sounds, but anything that wears the cloak of night, especially on an alien world, partakes of the night's mystery and terror. "Don't worry, sir," said 3PO. "R2 and I will keep watch. We don't require sleep, and there's nothing out there that can ingest us." Something sounding like a broken pipe gurgled stentorianly in the darkness and 3PO started. R2 gave a derisive beep, and the two droids moved out into the darkness. "Very funny," 3PO admonished his companion. "I hope one of the local carnivores chokes on you and breaks every one of your external senses." R2 whistled back, sounding unimpressed. The princess pressed close against Luke. He tried to comfort her without appearing anxious, but as the darkness closed to a Stygian blackness around them and the night sounds turned to sepulchral moans and hootings, his arm instinctively went around her shoulders. She didn't object. It made him feel good to sit there like that, leaning against her and trying to ignore the damp ground beneath. Something called out with an abyssal shrillness, startling Luke from his sleep. Nothing moved beyond the dying fire. With his free hand he tossed several shards of wood onto the embers, watched the fire blaze again. Then he happened to glance down at his companion's face. It was not the face of a princess and a senator or of a leader of the Rebel Alliance, but instead that of a chill child. Moistly parted in sleep, her lips seemed to beckon to him. He leaned closer, seeking refuge from the damp green and brown of the swamp in that hypnotic redness. He hesitated, pulled back. She was an aristocrat and rebel leader. For all he'd accomplished above Yavin, he was still only a pilot and, before that, a farmer's nephew. Peasant and princess, he mused disgustedly. His assignment was to protect her. He wouldn't abuse that trust, no matter his own hopeless hopes. He would defend her against anything that leapt out of the darkness, crawled from the slime, dropped from the gnarled branches they walked under. He would do it out of respect and admiration, and possibly out of the most powerful of emotions, unrequited love. He would even defend her from himself, he determined tiredly. In 5 minutes he was fast asleep. Any awkwardness was spared by the fact that he awakened first. Removing his arm from her shoulders, he nudged her gently once, twice. With the third nudge she sat straight up, eyes wide and staring with sudden wakefulness. She turned sharply to stare at him. Then the events of the past several days came flooding back to her and she relaxed a little. Sorry. I thought I was someplace else. I was a little frightened. She started to rummage through her survival pack, and Luke did the same with his. 3PO offered a cheery good morning. While the cloud-masked sun rose somewhere behind them, warming the mist slightly, they shared a meager breakfast of emergency cube concentrates. Whoever created these, she grimaced in distaste, biting off a small piece of a pink square, must have been part machine. They didn't program anything like taste or flavor into them. Luke tried not to let the awful taste he was experiencing show. Oh, I don't know. They're designed to keep you alive, not to taste good. Want another one? She extended a blue square with the consistency of dead sponge. Luke eyed it, half-smiled queasily. Not right away. I'm kind of full. She nodded knowingly, then smiled. He grinned back at her. The long day never grew truly comfortable, but their suits and the thermal capes kept them warm enough. By late morning it had grown sufficiently hot for them to unhook the capes, fold the thin material into small rectangles, and put them up in suit pockets. The rare breaks in the mist were never large enough to give them a view of the rising sun, though 3PO and R2 assured them it was there. It attacked the mist persistently, raising the light level from mere dimness to a kind of enthusiastic twilight. We should be getting close to the beacon, she told them all around midday. Luke wondered how many hours they'd slept. Nights and days would be long on Sakapus Mimban. We have to be prepared to find nothing, Princess. There might not be a beacon station. I know, she admitted quietly. We'll have to search, though. We can walk in an expanding spiral from the place I plotted, and hope. A long wall of trees and lesser growth lay ahead. They plunged into it without hesitating, trading ease of passage for secure footing. Pardon me, sir. Luke looked slightly ahead and to his right. Both robots had paused and C-3PO was leaning against something. What is it, 3PO? Your pardon, sir, but this isn't a tree I'm pressing against, the droid said, it's metal. I thought the matter worthy enough to bring to your notice. There is a possibility. A loud beep cut him off and he glared down at R2. Talk too much? What do you mean I talk too much, you factory second? Metal, it is metal. The princess was standing alongside the robots, waiting for Luke to make his way through the brush. R2, see if you can clear some of this undergrowth away. The little droid activated a small cutting flame, used it to burn a path through the jungle. It's a wall, it's got to be, Luke muttered as they walked parallel to the forest-scarred metal surface. Sure enough, the metal finally ended, and they emerged from the trees onto a modestly cleared roadway. It led into a street paved with packed clay earth. Buildings lined both sides of the glorified alley, marching resolutely into the swirling fogs. Warm yellow glows shone from lights hidden behind tightly sealed windows, illuminating and outlining raised metal sidewalks canopied against the mist and rain. Thank the Force, the princess murmured. First, Luke began, we find a place to get cleaned up. Then, he took a step forward. A hand caught his shoulder, held him back. He eyed Leia curiously. What's the matter? Think a minute, Luke, she urged him softly. This is more than just a simple homing beacon sight. Much more. Cautiously, she leaned around the corner of the metal wall, peered down the street. Figures were strolling along the metal walkways now. Others crossed the mist-slick street. It's too substantial for a scientific post, too. Luke turned his own attention to the shrouded streets, took in the figures, the crude shape of the structures. You're right. It's a big installation. Maybe some company from Secapus. No. She gestured sharply. Look there. Two figures were swaying down the center of the street. They wore armor instead of loose clothing, formed armor of white and black. Armor that was all too familiar. Both men carried their helmets casually. One dropped his, bent to retrieve it, kicked it accidentally up the street. His companion chided him. Cursing, the clumsy Imperial picked up his helmet, and the two continued on their meandering path. Luke's eyes had grown as wide as Leia's. Imperial stormtroopers, here. Without the Serkapusian's knowledge, or we'd have heard of it from the underground there. She was nodding excitedly. If the Serkapusians find out, they'll quit the Empire faster than a bureaucrat can quote forms. And who's going to inform them about the violation? Luke wanted to know. Why, we. The princess stopped, looked somber. We have 2 reasons to need help now, Luke. Shush, he whispered. They drew back further into the darkness. A large cluster of men and women appeared around the near corner. They were chatting softly among themselves, but it wasn't their inaudible conversation that intrigued Luke and Leia. They wore unusual clothing, coveralls of some black, reflective material which tucked into matching high boots. The coveralls rose to end in a cap that fit over the wearer's head. Some members of the group had their hoods up and fastened formed, others wore them folded flat against their upper back. Various types of equipment Luke didn't recognize hung and swayed from wide belts. Evidently the princess knew what they were. Miners, she informed him, watching as the group moved off down one metal walkway. They're wearing mining suits. The Empire's digging something valuable out of this planet, and the Serkapusians don't know a thing about it. How can you be so sure? Luke inquired. The princess sounded positive. They'd have their own installation here, and no troops. The Empire obviously doesn't want anyone to know about this. R2 whistled soft agreement. Further conversation was made impossible when the air was suddenly filled with a distant, violent howling. It sounded like a parade of demons tramping along just beneath the surface. The sound continued for several minutes, then ceased. Realization transformed the princess's expression. Energy mining, she explained breathlessly to Luke. They're using some big generators here. A thoughtful pause, then, that might account for the atmospheric disturbance which forced us down. I knew I'd read about that effect somewhere. A ship has to be specially insulated to drop down through an area where an energy drill is working. Byproducts, including excess charges, are shunted away skyward. But the fallout materials, if this world supports a native race, it's illegal, that kind of mining. Since when, observed Luke bitterly, did legalities ever matter to the Empire? You're right, of course. We can't stand here forever, he went on. First thing we have to do is obtain some substantial food. Those concentrates can keep you alive for only so long without some protein to work with. And, he added, glancing at her muddy exterior, we've got to get cleaned up. We can't attract any attention. Since Yavin and the Death Star we're both well known to Imperial enforcement officials, we'd be taken on sight. He studied her pilot suit, then his own. We can't go strolling around town in these. I think we'd better work on stealing a change of clothing. Steal, the princess objected, drawing herself up. From a possibly honest shopkeeper. If you think for a minute that a former princess of the royal house of Alderaan, a senator, is going to resort to. I'll steal them, Luke said curtly. He leaned around the metal corner. The mist-shrouded street was momentarily deserted and he beckoned for her to follow. They hugged the walls of the buildings, trying to pass quickly before any lit windows or open doors, slipping furtively from shadow to shadow. Luke hastily examined each storefront in passing. Finally he halted, indicated the sign above a doorway. "Miners supplies," he whispered. "This is the one we want." While the princess watched the walkways, he tried to peer through one dark window. "Maybe it's a holiday," he guessed hopefully. "More likely the only establishments open this time of night sell nothing but intoxicants," the princess pointed out prosaically. "What now?" She looked uncomfortable. By way of reply, Luke led her around back. The rear entrance he'd hoped for was there. But it was secured, as he'd feared. To complicate matters, there was a broad open lane behind the buildings, from which the jungle and bog had been shunted away. If anyone happened to come walking past, they'd have nowhere to hide. "Wonderful," the princess observed as Luke tried the locked portal. "How do we get in?" She was indicating the seamless metal door which, no doubt, was locked and controlled from the inside. The back of the building was devoid of windows, possibly to foil intentions such as theirs. Luke removed the lightsaber from his waist, very slowly adjusted the controls set in the handle. "What are you going to do, Luke?" "I don't know how big this town is, but a noisy break-in would attract too much attention. So I'm trying not to be noisy." Watching with interest, the princess took a couple of steps back, looking nervously up and down the alleyway. Any second she expected to see a squad of angry troopers racing around a corner toward her, alerted by some hidden alarm they had unknowingly triggered. Only jungle sounds reached her, however, as Luke activated his saber. Instead of the meter-plus shaft of white energy, the pommel put forth a short, needle-thin spoke. With concentration worthy of a master craftsman, Luke stepped forward and moved the energy beam along the slight space visible between door and frame. A third of the way down the door a distinct click sounded and the door slid obediently aside. Readjusting his saber, Luke flicked it off and replaced it at his waist. "Go ahead," she told him. "The droids and I will keep watch." He nodded, vanished inside. Luke's principal objective was conveniently located close to the back of the store. He spent several minutes scrounging through the racks before he found what he wanted. Taking the well-used clothing, he hurried to the back entrance and tossed the booty to the princess. Then he stepped just outside the door, reached back in and touched the close stud. He pulled his arm clear as the door slid shut behind him. With luck it might be several weeks before the storekeeper discovered his loss. Well pleased with himself, Luke stepped down to the ground and began unsnapping his flight suit. He was partly undressed when he paused and noticed the princess standing and staring at him. "Come on. We have to hurry." She put hands on seal curve hips, cocked her head to one side and stared meaningfully at him. "Oh," he murmured, half smiling. He turned away and continued undressing. Feeling that nothing had changed behind him, he sneaked a glance, saw the princess still eyeing him uncomfortably. "What's wrong, princess?" She sounded embarrassed. "Luke, I like you, and we've known each other for a while, but I'm not sure I can trust you, now." He grinned. "You know it won't make any difference if the stormtroopers find us here in our flight suits." He gestured. "You can change in the bush." Turning away from her, he continued changing his own attire. She looked back at the nearby jungle. Tiny yellow points of light, the eyes of unknown creatures, winked on and off in the bushes. Strange, discomforting sounds hissed and bleated at her. She sighed, started to slip out of her own flight suit, then paused. "Well, what are you two staring at?" "Oh, sorry, An insistent whistle. "Yes, you're right, R2. Both droids turned away from the princess. Shortly, Luke was able to turn and study her approvingly. Her simple, worn suit was a bit snug, but otherwise looked quite natural on her. Well, she asked, obviously not enthralled with her new wardrobe. What are you staring at? I think maybe something in a print. He began. He had to react quickly to duck the boot she threw at him. It clattered off the metal door. Sorry, he told her, sounding like he meant it as he picked up the boot. Bending over his old suit, he began transferring various items from it and from his backpack to the belt pouches of the miner's uniform. One small case he flipped open carefully, went rapidly through its contents before snapping it shut and slipping it into a pocket. I've got enough Imperial currency to last us a while. You? She glanced away from him. What would a representative of the Alliance be doing with common currency on a diplomatic mission? Luke sighed. We'll make do, I suppose. How would you like something to eat besides a concentrate? She faced him, visibly more cheerful. I could eat half a chosho, Luke. Are you sure we ought to though? We have to mingle sometime. As long as we don't look or act like total strangers, no one should bother us. They started back toward the main street, after burying their packs and flight suits in a syrupy bog. They were halfway there when the increasing light caused Luke to stop. What's the matter? The princess asked, worried. Two things, Luke insisted, eyeing her. First of all, there's your walk. And what's wrong with my walk? Nothing. That's the trouble. Her brows drew together in puzzlement. I don't follow you, Luke. He explained slowly. You're walking like a princess. Not like a working woman. Slump your shoulders, take some of the confidence and distance out of your stride. Stagger a little. You've got to walk like a tired mineral grubber, not like one of the Imperial family. And then there's the second thing. Reaching out, he tousled her neat head violently. Hey, she objected, struggling. When he stepped back, her hair formed a nebulous maze of undisciplined strands around her head and face, the intricate double bun she'd worn now completely obliterated. That's better, he observed, but there's still something not right. After a moment, he reached down. Picked up a handful of moist earth, then stepped toward her. Oh no, she warned him, putting up both hands defensively and moving backward. I've been living in sludge for days. I'm not letting you smear that gunk on me. Have it your way, Leia. He dropped the dirt and it hit the ground with a loud splat. You do it. The princess hesitated. Then, using spit and hands and a minimum of dirt, she succeeded in wiping every trace of makeup from her face and dirtying it as little as possible. How's this? She asked guardedly. Luke nodded approvingly. Much better. You look like someone who's been out in the desert too long without water. Thanks, she muttered. I'm beginning to feel like it, too. It's necessary. I just want to see us get off this world alive. We won't if we don't find that food you mentioned. He had to hurry to catch up with her as she headed toward the street.